you aren't being a proper woman, therefore you must be a witch. You must be a witch.
Welcome, everybody. Welcome back to the Missing Witches podcast. Welcome, electrical energy of the spring and the river that I'm near, and of tides changing, elections happening, votes accumulating, black cats circling, and of all the stories that are pushing in at the edges, asking to be remembered. I'm going to breathe and remind myself that all of my flaws and nerves and aches are welcome here. And all of yours are too. Thanks for showing up in whatever way your body and mind and magic are here with you today. And thanks so much to my guest. I'm so thrilled. We have read Danielle Dulsky's inspired, incantatory writing in our circles before. We've whispered to each other from bones and honey to shore up our courage, and heard stories from members of our circle who studied with Danielle in the Hag School. And I'm so excited to get to sit virtually through a portal, smiling at each other today to talk about this new beautiful book that's been walking with me as I've been going through the strange initiation of radiation here. The Beautiful Night House. What an electric book. Thank you so much for being here. How are you? And in the spirit of something we remind ourselves of a lot in our coven, that we don't have to be who we were 5 minutes ago. Who are you today?
Wow. Well, thanks for having me. Who am I today? I love that. I don't have to be the same as I was yesterday. I'm not. The new moon dawned yesterday, and I did really feel like it was a threshold moment. So today I identify as a witch, an author, a cat mother, also a dog mother, mother to my sons also, but they feel well and whole and also a little bit distant today. So yeah, I'll leave it at that. Witch, writer, mother.
I feel that. I feel all that witch, writer, mother, magic. Can you talk about writing this book? How was this one the same or different from the other ones? Why did this one feel like it needed to be born now?
Yeah. Well, so Bones and Honey, I wrote very quickly because sort of like when I'm left to my own devices, that's the way I write, in these kind of short, prosy but poetic paragraphs. And then I'm kind of like in and out describing the thing that I find compelling and not going on and on about it. So that I had gathered all of these paragraphs of prayers for many years. So when it came time to stitch that one together, it just kind of like came out really quickly. And then this book of fairy tales, originally it was going to be a kind of like Course in Miracles, but cooler with fairy tales. Like that was my intention. That was what it was billed as in the book proposal. And then there was some conversations with my editor, and it was like, let's amplify the fairy tales. And then I suddenly was like, well, that's what I've wanted to do this whole time. I just didn't. I know that even with people like us who really love fairy tales, there's still a huge part of our psyches that necessarily takes fairy tales less seriously because they were sold to us as only children's stories, and we know how many of them have been Disneyfied. And so there was like an ache around that because I really want people to take my book seriously. And I know how that word or that phrase fairy tales feels in the body. So my mission then was to write a book about fairy tales that also amplified how cool they are and how subversive they are and how they've really been agents of social change for centuries, if not longer. So, once that, I always need a kind of like activist mission with my books. Or else, because I'm Aquarius, and if I don't have that, I feel like, what's the point? I'm just kind of screaming into the void. So once I had that kind of angle and fell in love with it and did a lot of research around it, then the book kind of poured out of me really quickly, and necessarily so, because I had a shorter deadline with this book than any of my other books. I've usually had 9 months, and this one I had 3 while moving house. And basically burning my life down and seeing a new life reborn. So this book was really written in my personal fire also. But yeah.
Wild. Oh my gosh, what a tight time frame. Because there's a lot of research in this one. Like I can see how being able to channel prayers and impressions and responses to the world could come more quickly. Can you talk about some of the things you discovered in your research that you were like, fuck yes, I knew it. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, I think I might come up with more as I talk, but at least 2 fuck yes moments. And the first one was well, I had known that these stories were primarily transmitted by women, collected by men. I knew that these stories, the orally transmitted fairy tales, not the literary fairy tales where we know who the author is, but the orally transmitted fairy tales, I knew that we don't really know where they come from. But what I discovered that was a fuck yes is that there is this strong Jungian idea that they originated in someone's dream. And so, someone woke up one day like we do, and they turned to the person who's there and like, oh my God, you're not going to believe what I dreamt about. And then the way we still describe a dream to whoever is willing to listen to us, when we describe our dream, we tell it like a story. So, we say like, so I was walking down this road and there's this real once upon a time to the dream story. So I love the idea that these weird fairy tales just started as somebody's dream and then were just kind of whispered down the lane for centuries, if not thousands of years. And now we have this current incarnation of the story, and it may continue to change as we continue to tell it. So that was a big fuck yes moment for me, because I'm a huge dream nerd. So the emergence of the dreams and the fairy tales, that was very cool. And then the other fuck yes moment was this current of the who I call the warrior bird woman. So there's a story in the Night House that's originally called Fitcher's Bird, which is essentially a version of Bluebeard, but just so much cooler than the versions of Bluebeard that I think that we are used to. And so I was familiar with that story, but what I was not familiar with that came out in the research, primarily from the work of Marina Warner. She writes a lot of scholarly fairy tale books, and she was talking about how like the bird image and Mother Goose, who we're familiar with, and it was a derogatory way of looking at gossiping women. And these stories were primarily told in like the weaving houses and the birthing rooms. So these were like low class women who were telling these stories. And so they would be looked at as these gossiping bird women that were just like, clapping their beaks when they were talking, but they were telling this story. And how some of these stories that have these shape-shifting bird women in them, that it was sort of a way of striking at that idea that they were being dismissed as these, gossipy kind of low-class women. So, and not just striking at it, but like taking the power back of that bird woman image. So, and there's like some sexual currents to it too, which is really cool. Like the idea of the stork coming to drop off the baby, that is actually the stork being the bird is kind of the sexual act, which I didn't know. So yeah, so that really led me down a few rabbit holes. But that was another fuck yeah, was like this idea of the subversive bird woman that shows up in these fairy tales, and how these stories have kind of flown under the radar and weren't hunted or outlawed, although they were in some instances, but not broadly outlawed like we would think magical practices would be, because they were able to just be fairy tales. So when that term fairy tale started being used just in recent centuries that maybe, and we don't know, but maybe that was on purpose to make it look like these stories were just children's stories so that they wouldn't be hunted and outlawed. So yeah, so I love things like that. I love the histories where like the spells and the recipes were wrapped inside a folk song and it was just kind of dismissed as a song, and also fairy tales. So yeah, lots of fuck yeah moments around that.
Yeah, completely. It's taking me a really long time to read this book, and I'm usually like an eater of books, but because there's work. There's a lot of homework,
Yeah.
which I appreciate. It really is like I feel really accompanied where I'm at right now in doing it through this book. I wondered if you could talk about how you were able to sort of find ritual in story places.
Yeah. Yeah. First, I'll say, yeah, the book is dense because, again, originally it was this core, we were meant to sort of complete it step by step. And then if I was amplifying the stories, I had to, out of necessity, get away from that a little bit because the stories do have this energetic current to them. And so, if you're familiar with energy medicine, there's an old idea that the medicine always goes to the wound no matter what. And so when you're sitting in a circle with people in real life or virtually and you're sharing a story and then you share a reflection at the end, you can instantly see that everyone saw something different. Everyone is sort of landing in a different place inside the story. There's often very intense and heated conversations because some of these stories cause visceral reactions in people. But you can always see at that point that the medicine did go where it needed to go, and it's different for everyone. So it was, you know, digging out certain rites, rituals, and spells and small personal ceremonies where not every single one of them is going to fit everybody, and the landscape of everybody's life is different. So it was trying to figure out 3 different rites for every story there were meant to be 13, but really there's 14 stories because I kind of tucked 2 inside one chapter. There's 14 stories and each of them have these 3 different rites attached to them. And so as I'm writing, I'm knowing and very conscious of not every single person that reads this book is going to do every single thing that I'm inviting them to do. And then also because of that, there's like some of the stories that are in here, say the German version of Cinderella, the Ash Fool, that's in the Night House, and I love that version of Cinderella. There's a whole manifestation spell that is inside that story that I didn't put there. It was already there. And a lot of the stories are like that. A lot of the stories already have this spell and even like a spoken charm that were tucked inside this story. And so another fuck yeah moment that I have had, though not really while I was writing the book, it came a little bit before, but still was this understanding that yeah, these stories have been translated. So the charm that's in Cinderella, shiver and shake little tree, silver and gold rain down upon me, that was translated from the German, but it's still so cool, and that it has been transmitted at least for centuries, so at least for hundreds of years, if not longer, because again, we don't really know how old these stories are or where they come from. And so the accumulated wisdom and the accumulated power that is now wrapped inside that charm because it's been spoken over the centuries and so many generations. So some of the stories already had the magic wrapped inside them, and I just was amplifying it in the Night House. And then there were other stories where it was just kind of looking at the guiding theme and the different life areas that it might illuminate for whoever was receiving the story, and then what can be done to mark different thresholds or rites of passage. And then also for purposes of divination, which I think is maybe the easiest and most accessible point for people, is just to simply look at, if you're looking for a place to start and you're not going to bury the branch and burn all the things and do the things that I was inviting you to do, is totally fine. All you need to do is, when you hear an old story for the first time, or maybe it's one you've heard before, but you're hearing it now as if for the first time, then you just kind of listen to that story. And at the end of the story, you name what feels to you like the missing piece, or like the frustrating part of the plot line, or like the thing that the character did that upset you so much. You name that thing as in the form of a question, like, why did her father do that to her, or whatever. And then you ask yourself, well, what's underneath that? And why did I ask that? Like, how is that the very question of my life? I could have asked anything, but I asked that. And that is something that, especially in a circle of people where, there's 20 people that are sharing these questions, they are always all different. And so that really reveals a lot when you're hearing, like, and you're like, yeah, I kind of wondered that, but not really. That's not, but what about this? And it's always like, that's your thing. That's the very question of your life. So in that way, the stories, if nothing else, they're oracular, and they sort of point you toward like what the next step is on your journey. Like maybe that's the next thing that needs to be healed. Maybe that's the next thing that you're meant to teach. But it always shows you like what that next step is, just looking at that one question that you have that's apparently just about the story. It's never just about the story. So yeah, I don't even remember what your original question was.
It doesn't matter. No, I found that so exciting. I was going to ask you about that exact bit. So I'm so happy you brought that up,
Yeah.
because I do find that that was such an interesting piece for me to add to my own way of working. It's like, why am I troubled by that one thing? Why are fairy tales in particular like that for me, where I hear a story and I'm annoyed by something, or like I'm troubled by something? Do you know? Like there's something that feels like this just makes no sense, or like, what is this story for? Where does this come from? Why did she listen to the fucking wolf in the first place, or whatever it is? But I found that really juicy. I really loved that idea from you. Thank you so much. Can I read you a bit of your own book?
Yes, please.
Hey, where was this piece I wanted? I want to talk about archetype. And I think, come on, get here. Okay, I want to talk about archetype, but I also want to talk about this idea that you offer us in the Swan Maiden. So you've invited us to sort of hold a personal paradox across our bodies, one on each side, and then to sort of rock with it. And then to begin sort of shape-shifting back and forth between the two. As the rhythm quickens, you might begin to sense that a third energy is present, a third road, opening between this and that, an energetic invitation to hold the tension of both roles at once. Take care with yourself, as this work can be intense, but begin to sense the both as the power source. You are not this and then that. You are both at once. You are all. I want to talk about the third road. This is something we talk about so much in our coven, the possibility of both and, that witchcraft kind of invites us to move between two, to not get stuck in binaries. And I was so excited to hear it described as a power source. Can you say more?
Yeah, that the raising of the paradox, which is what I call that, is something I've done in my work for, I don't know, at least 15 years, and didn't share it with other people for a long time because it was something that I kind of arrived at, and nobody really taught me how to do it. I just kind of arrived at this through certain embodied practices and working with energy medicine and energy healing. And then when I started sharing it with other people, seeing the kind of weepy, visceral reactions that people would have, because, and the way they would describe it is, we're so socialized to think that we must be in a pure form all the time. And so, the idea that like, well, I'm only this or I'm only that. And then we know that that's not true. We know that we are this convergence of all of these different energies and roles and parts and characters and archetypal energies also. So there's sort of often a sense of being defeated, or like that's like a source of weakness, that, we're just this kind of energetic mess. But being able to frame that as actually a power source, it's not really doing anything different, because it's just sort of naming, like, you already know these roles converge in you, but now let's look at that as actually the power source that is, if you raise the paradox in that way, where you are consciously shifting between this state of being only this and then only that, and then you go quicker and quicker and quicker. So if we're talking about Swan Maiden, then the paradox is sort of the tame, civilized self, which is likely very palatable to well, maybe not very, but it's at least more palatable to the overculture. It's the part of you that you show the world. It's, what you list on your taxes, your career or whatever. And then that's fine. And we need to be that. But then there's this wilder, uncivilized, more creaturely self that's probably less palatable to the overculture, and not just to the overculture, but maybe even to your people, and in some cases also to you sometimes. And so being able to be like, okay, I'm only the civilized self. How do they spend their days? Where do they find meaning? And then I'm only the wild self. How does this creature find meaning in life? What would it be like to be only that? And generally there's a feeling of like, well, I don't want to be only this or only that ever. And so you're just shifting between the two energetically, and you try to raise the paradox by going quicker and quicker and quicker until this third thing that generally transcends language. Usually people struggle to describe what this third road or third way is, but it is the all. Like I say in the book, it is the convergence of this and that until this third thing emerges, and then that becomes the power source. So in a spell container, you can then use that as the power source to infuse the intention. You can also use it for divination, where you sort of feel like you're looking through that portal that opens up, that is that third road or third way. So those are the two different ways that I use it. But yeah, almost always when you ask people to name two roles that they play in life, that they know they're both, but it feels like they can't be both at once. That if they are going to be the wolf woman on the mountain, they can't be the banker, right? And then vice versa. But when you raise the paradox, you realize, well, I am the wolf woman banker. And that actually that is a power source and not something that should be a source of defeat. So yeah. But the stories really illuminate that. The old stories really illuminate that idea, especially the shape-shifting woman stories, because they almost always have this kind of land self that is more civilized, where they are maybe the wife or the mother for a time, but they never remain that. And so often these stories have endings that seem sad because they're kind of love stories that don't have the happy ending. But really, at the end, she's returning to her bird form in the Swan Maiden, or her seal form in the Selkie stories, or her fox form if it's the fox woman story. So there's all of these different sort of shape-shifting woman stories where the initiation, the cave, isn't the sky or the water, it's the house. And being housewife and doing the mundane task, that's sort of the underworld cave, and then the emergence comes when she returns to the animal form. So I know that that's relatable for a lot of people.
Yeah, completely. Can you talk about being a witch in the fascist era?
Yeah, we're all doing the best we can. I think, at least as I am witch and getting older, and so I'm really thinking about, I was born in 1980 and seeing the way the world has changed. You too? Oh wow. So yeah, so we've seen a lot. And if we didn't see it ourselves, we heard about it from our grandparents and our parents. And so thinking about the parallel between our own personal myths and the stories that we really identify with, that we personally have lived, and our initiations that feel like part of the smaller story, but really the way that has mirrored and reflected the world story and the global underworld journey. I think most people can name, for instance, in 2020 and 2021, a big personal initiation that was going on that kind of seemed a little bit independent of the gnarly world story that was going on. So I think a part of me as witch, yes, there's activist and there's rage and righteous rage and all of that. And then there's also being able to kind of step back a little bit and not anymore for me be so in awe that I get to be here for this. I still have that, but in 2020 I used to cry all the time like I can't believe I get to be here for this. This is obviously a wild moment, but now there's this, which is still a wild moment but in a different way. And I do feel in a weird way lucky to be here for it. Like I don't really know how the story ends. I don't know that I'm going to get to see how the story ends, but I feel privileged that I can step back and kind of behold the narrative, which, yeah, my witchcraft helps me do that, but so does my storytelling. Like that, this narrative intelligence, which is sort of being able to step back and behold the larger arc and plot line in the story is helpful, because then you're like, well, what character am I in this weird story? So yeah, I don't know if that answers your question. That's what I have today.
Yeah. How do you think our personal stories work with the energy of the overstory, of the larger story? I think you're so right when you point out that everybody went through a transformation that felt really personal and somehow separate
Yeah.
from the crisis.
Yeah.
Why does that happen? How does it work together? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, in the end, I don't know, but I do think that
I mean, how
we
could you? But I love to hear what you think.
yeah, what I mean, yeah, that's fine. I I love to tell people what I think all the time.
I'm the same. I love having opinions, and I want you to just have a big caveat around all of my opinions.
I think, the simple answer is that we are co-created. You know, the characters that we are in the story that we are living, we are co-created not just by our families and our people, but and our local communities, but also from this global community at large, which if you were born in 1980, we were born in a time where we weren't really connected to the global community, not in the same way, and, went through all of school before the birth of the internet. So having this kind of weird, connectivity all over the world, and yet complete lack of intimacy in some instances, via social media doesn't necessarily feel that intimate to me. So, I think the reason why sometimes our smaller stories mirror the larger story is just because of the way we are communicating, and we're able to kind of see our role in this story that's so much bigger than us, that started before we were born, that won't be over until long after we're dead, in this incarnation anyway. So yeah, so why does it happen? I don't really know, but I know that it happens.
It really does. Okay, can you talk about archetypes and magic a little bit?
Yeah. So archetype means high form or original form. So an archetype is essentially the original blueprint of a particular energy, a particular thing. And so one of my favorite quotes about archetypes, Dr. Esty said in a training that I did with her back in 2019, which was, and she kind of like said it as a one-off and like didn't really expand upon it, but I wrote it down and I underlined it, because she said archetypes don't understand our human needs. And I do think when you are in need of a medicinal archetype in your life, so for instance, the sovereign archetype, which is so common in the old stories, the king, the queen, the princes, the princesses, that you sort of get so attracted to it. And there's sometimes an unhealthy over identification with that archetypal energy. And, it's coming from a good impulse. It's coming from this place like, well, I need this medicine. Let's say you've just gotten out of a relationship where you had no power or control whatsoever. Then there's this craving to be queen and put the crown on. And yet, if you become only queen, if you invite that archetypal energy in, and that's sort of the story you are living day in and day out, then, you might be stepping into a place where you're not just getting your power back, but you might be exerting that power over other people and getting more into the shadow form of the ruler archetype. So archetypes are kind of these bubbles of meaning that are very like small gods. And I know that lots of witches argue with me about that. And I know that there are traditions where that wouldn't make sense. But to my mind, it's like a deity would be this deep well of power. So an example that I often give, I work a lot with Queen Maeve in my witchcraft, and my entire mother line is Irish. So I have ancestors that have paid into this deep well of power that is Queen Maeve. Every time I light a candle for her or put some wine on or honey on her altar, which she likes, then I'm putting a deposit into that deep well of power that is Queen Maeve, so that when I call on Queen Maeve energy in a manifestation spell or something like that, I'm kind of making this small energetic withdrawal. But I can do that because I've paid into it and my ancestors have paid into this well of power. Archetypes are the same. Archetypes are this well of power. And every time somebody tells a story with a king or a queen in it, it's getting amplified in that particular way. So archetypes can be medicinal or they can be problematic depending on, if we're already swimming in that archetypal energy, which we know that king energy, we've been swimming in that energy for hundreds of years. So but the stories that have kings, queens, princes, and princesses in them, I know that that's often a core complaint about fairy tales, because it's like, we don't care about these royal people showing up in the stories, but it's the sovereign archetype. So if there's a king or a queen in the story, remember, these were told by the midwives and the weaver women. They were never told by the kings and the queens. So, the things that happen to the kings and the queens in these stories, it isn't usually like they start in power and then they're still in power at the end of the story. There's some great transformation that the kings, queens, princes, and princesses are going through. And we look at that then as mirroring what our own inner sovereign is going through. So the inner sovereign is the part of you that sets your rules, that remakes your boundaries and takes down the old ones when they don't make sense anymore. So we can always see that the archetypes that are showing up in the old stories, they are meant to teach and transform and maybe be embodied and understood for a time, but never forever. Because then you'll be dreaming about them, then, you'll start dressing like them. And, if I was only Queen Maeve, she was a badass, but she was often at war. There was a weird relationship with her sons, and I have sons, so I don't want to necessarily, and she died by getting shot in the head with a piece of cheese. I don't want that.
Not ideal. I mean, cheese may be better than other things, but
Right. So archetypes are cool. I know they're compelling. There's a little bit of like what's the right word? Attention around them. They aren't soft. They are these kind of sharp energies that are just the purest form of that thing. So sometimes we need a little bit of that medicine, and sometimes it's not particularly great.
yeah, that's so interesting way of thinking about the sovereign. I have a little kid and she's like really heavy into princesses, but like they're superheroes. Yeah. Yeah.
It makes sense. Like princesses and princes in stories, they're the maturing sovereign. So, I think that it's a healthy thing to identify. I know the Disney version of the princess might have weirdness around it, but it's a healthy childhood impulse, I think, to identify with the prince or the princess archetype.
And especially developmentally, like that, you're so accurate about that like it's a sense of control for her, of her own sovereign self. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Right. She's figuring out what she can get away with, where the boundaries should go. What can I say to this person and not say to that person? That's the inner princess. And we still have the inner princess.
Yeah. Even just developing an eye, like an eye separate from you, separate from your parents or whatever, that piece of identity.
Yeah.
I want to know more about, so there's this sort of a question that I always have with people who are powerful. It's the like, I phrase it in a joking way, but you'll know what I mean. It's the like, who gave you permission? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. Who gave me permission? I know. I think about a student in one of my yoga classes forever ago, and I forget we were doing some ritual, something that was not of traditional yoga. And they were like, "Are you allowed to do do this in here?" Um, I grew up in this weird household where, and I know that we all did, but my particular brand of weird was my mother, especially at certain phases of my childhood, was very born again Christian. She kind of renounced Irish Catholicism that she grew up with, and she was this born again Christian. And I was enrolled in a Christian school and also went to church twice a week. And then my father, who they were married and divorced 3 times. It was a very volatile relationship they had. Married and divorced 3 times before I turned 16. So it wasn't like over the landscape of my entire life.
Just to each other over and over again.
Yes. Yeah.
Wow.
Just to
Okay.
each other.
Making and unmaking your world over and over again. Okay.
Yeah. And he was this kind of atheist outlaw Vietnam vet biker. And so he was godless and like was proud of it. And so, and they raised me. And then half of the time because they also were both involved in their individual addictions. So they weren't able to raise children for a lot of my childhood. And so I was at my paternal grandparents' house, which was totally different. Cookies in the oven, loving household. How was school today? I didn't have that at my parents' house. And so the father that I had being really a criminal in a lot of ways. I mean, one of my favorite stories about him, which is alive because it's an Easter story, is it was like my mom was a night nurse. She was working Easter Eve, and my dad has a 2 a.m. oh shit moment because he was supposed to get the Easter baskets and stuff for my sister and I. So he calls his biker friends, or maybe they were already at the house, I don't know. But he gets on the motorcycles and they go into town and they throw a brick through the toy store window and they steal the entire Easter display of like the stuffed bunnies and the candy. And they're like driving through the town with the stuffed bunnies under their arms. So it was illegal. And yet my sister and I remember that Easter morning just being like the greatest Easter morning ever. So I grew up with this parental figure who was really, if I had to like distill one lesson that my father gave me, he died in 2007. It's like, figure out how much you can get away with always and do exactly that much. Like, don't be too timid and step back, like, go to that boundary line. So your question about like who gave you permission, my father gave me permission because it was like, he wasn't a witch in any way, but he was very he lived his life the way he lived his life and he got away with it most of the time. And I live a very different life from my father. I'm not robbing toy stores in the middle of the night, but I do kind of feel, especially now when there are technically legal things that are going on that I know are not right, the legal or the illegal, whether it's what I'm allowed to do as a witch or what I'm allowed to do and not get arrested, it's the same for me. It's like, I'm going to do exactly what I feel is right. And if I remember a teacher in the past that gave me permission to do it, great. And, if it's something that I just feel from my own gnosis is the right thing to do, then I'm going to do that too. I don't know that I would have answered that question the same way yesterday, but that's how I feel today.
I feel that. I do. I remember walking with my dad. I would stay with him for like a week in the summers. And I remember walking with him through Kensington Market in Toronto and walking through all the red lights and sort of hesitating because that's not really how things were in the rest of my life. And him telling me, like, you got to practice breaking small laws so you don't get used to authoritarianism. I was like, okay, good, important note.
Yes, exactly.
Like, go back to the suburbs with that information.
Trying not to be like so good all the time. I mean, that was a huge part of my upbringing. And then like having the tension between the Christian school where you just had to be a good girl or you would get punished. And then having my father be like, that's not
Yeah.
really true. Yeah.
Yeah, I really get that. Especially now I'm staying in Montreal again and I take the metro to the hospital to do radiation every day. And I go by my old private Catholic girls' school and the girls get on and off and I see this reflection of myself, no hair, my breasts have been cut and removed. Like I'm moving through layers of time. And I'm just very aware of the fact that we all are, that we're moving
Yeah.
past these versions of ourselves and that it is invented in a way that like my will matters. It's not the only thing that matters, otherwise I probably wouldn't have chosen this.
Yeah.
But it does
Right.
matter. I'm participating in shaping this,
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. That does bring me to, can I read a little bit from right the very end?
Yes.
Is that okay? Yeah.
Please. Nobody ever reads my own books to me. This is very special.
Well, I really enjoy reading these out loud because there's a lot of really powerful magic in them, but also the language is very juicy.
Thank you.
Mhm. All right. So this is really towards the end, and it's an invitation and such an exciting one. You write, the rooms you visited in the night house in these pages are an invitation to become a tale tender. To initiate means to begin, after all, so begin now. Initiate the new story. Tell a tale that troubles the systems in your world that you would like to see fall, that wakes the very beast that will swallow the outmoded structures whole, that dismantles the old beliefs and burns their house to the ground, that bewitches the kings to lay down their swords and amplifies the sound of the bones' song. Bring others to the night house. Now you know the way.
Yes.
Can you unpack more of this invitation for us? How do we leave here and use stories to dismantle what's dangerous and violent in the overculture?
I think well, I guess I don't want to use the word simple, but the most accessible way to go about it is to for me, if I'm looking for a certain story that's gonna like give me all the answers or whatever, I almost never find it. I have to start from this place of just being open and looking for the story that's coming for me or usually returning for me. So usually the stories that I feel I'm meant to tell and tend are stories that I've heard, that I've known maybe for a very long time. And they've shown up in many different ways. So if I look, I can see that, Cinderella shows up in the movie Anora, for example. So, these old stories, the plot is the same and it just keeps getting reincarnated and certain different details get amplified, but it still shows up in these accessible places like the Netflix series that we're streaming, and also more mystically in sometimes our dreams. Again, if we sort of look at our dreams like a story, then we can sort of be able to become more open for a guiding story to find us. And an important point, and this comes from Joseph Campbell's work, he emphasizes this in several of his books, where like you almost always kind of feel like you're dancing around it. Like you're never going to feel like you're doing it right. You're never going to feel like I found the exact right story. This is totally mine. Because there's always going to be something in the plot that doesn't make sense or that you think is too weird. And then you want to just kind of throw out the whole story. Don't do that. Because sometimes it's just one image in the story that gives you the answer. So you can almost look for that most vivid image. So this is my recommendation. You sort of, let's say you feel like Sleeping Beauty is a thing because you kind of remember it from childhood, and maybe you've been seeing roses over and over again, and for some reason there's a meme that you saw on Instagram that you ended up saving. So don't necessarily only look to the magical places, because it can be the relatively mundane places that the story shows up. So let's say it's that and you're like, I think maybe Sleeping Beauty is a thing. Read at least 3 different versions of it. or watch. If you watch the Disney movie, that would count. But you try to read at least 3 different versions so that you can then see what the bones of the story are. You can then see what doesn't really change. If you can find original collected versions of the story, then that's good. But they can also just be somebody's blog that, you know, they decided to revision this story. And then you kind of let it sit. So you read different versions of it, you kind of let it sit. You ask yourself, what is the loudest image in this story? So say it's a rose. You go find that in nature. So let's say you find a rock that looks like a rose. You put it on your altar and you just let it brew. You let it sit, and then you'll know when it's time to speak the story out loud. Maybe it's like 3 days, maybe it's like 3 months or a year, but you'll get to a place, if you have the altar for the story especially, you'll get to a place where it's time to speak the story out loud, and importantly, let it be witnessed, if only by your cat and your dog and your ghosts. Ideally, there's a living person that's listening to you, because it does change it a little bit, but you have this sense of, I'm not just telling it alone in the dark. I'm speaking to my ancestors or to future me or to someone. And then and only when you speak the story out loud, do you realize that it is oracular, because there's going to be something you say that you didn't expect to say. There's going to be a character that you describe in this weird way, and you're like, where the fuck did that come from? It's as if the other world is just speaking right through you, and you don't really get that proof for yourself until you take the leap and try to tell it. It'll be imperfect. You'll forget bits and you'll have to go back, and that's okay. Still, there'll be these moments where you, as the teller, realize why you are speaking this story out loud. And once you get to that point, you can't help it. You're going to tell the story again and again, probably for the rest of your life. But you don't get to that place until you speak the story out loud for the first time, and you have that witch's proof that, like, oh, there is something in this story that I didn't get until I let it spill from my tongue. So yeah, bring others to the night house. Now you know the way. That's what I meant by that.
Does telling it to others, how does it change them, do you think? Or like, what is it about stories, that the way that they travel, that has some kind of power?
Well, I think it has, I don't know, but I think it has something to do with, a story is always co-created by the teller, the people that are listening to it or reading it, and then this other thing that I'm just going to call the other world, or sometimes I call it the wild unseen. It's the implicate realm that's, you know, less visible to us, where all the visible things are from, where all of the visible things are sourced. So when there's more people that are listening to it, then we have more of these variables that are coming in to change the story and let it become something new. So that's what I think. I do have a knowing in my experience that, like, if I'm going to tell a story for the first time to a group, then I'm practicing it in, you know, while I'm curling my hair, or while I'm just talking to my cat or going for a walk. And I'm, you know, getting to the point where I'm familiar enough with the plot that I feel comfortable to tell this story. But I still know that when I speak that story in the room with all those people, there's going to be something new that comes out. And I also have a knowing that it doesn't always seem to be for me, like that new thing that I amplify. I'm thinking of this moment when I told the Handless Maiden story, which is a story I've told 10 million times. And I was just getting so into describing the devil. And I usually like write off the devil as this weird character in the story. And I'm just so into describing the devil. And then at the end, someone came up to me and revealed a story. And I'm like, that's why I was doing that. You know, it wasn't just me. I was doing that unconsciously for them, describing the devil in this particular way. So I think it has something to do with that. There's just more energetic hands afoot when there's more people, and the story's going to become what it needs to become, regardless of what I'm intending as the facilitator.
That's such an exciting way to describe it. And I know that you're right, especially as a mom of a kid that has like remembered, she's asking me origin stories for mermaids. And I'm remembering a story about Melusine and I'm sort of making it up and things are coming and suddenly she's like weeping and it's really emotional for her and trying to understand why it's hitting her so much, and just something spun between us that the idea of like going back to the magical world or leaving your family behind because they didn't trust you behind the closed door, you and your magic or something hitter,
Right.
Yeah.
And like I think in modern witchcraft, something that we don't readily have, at least not often, is proof that our own words are powerful. I think maybe that's especially true for newer witches, but you're reading out of the spell book and maybe it's a charm that was written 10 years ago and not one that was written 500 years ago, but you're still repeating it and it feels a little bit rote. So we don't often encounter in our witchcraft these opportunities to not only allow something else to kind of speak through us, because we know that that's scary, but if you're just telling a story, it's a little bit less scary and it is still happening. And then proof that like, oh, those words really mattered and they came out of me, but also not really. We don't have a lot of places in our witchcraft where we allow that to happen, I don't think. And so storytelling, and I teach this sometimes, like storytelling can be a back door to any number of magical practices, especially working with a deity. Like if you're feeling called to work with a particular goddess, for example, and you aren't really sure how to do it, and you've got all the old church wounds and you're like not wanting to pray to anybody and all of that. I've heard all of that and I've lived all of that. And so find a story that's part of their mythology and just begin to kind of map that story and speak the story out loud. Again, build the altar to the story. And, you're just telling the story of this particular goddess, but you're not. Like there's something else, something much bigger that starts to come through you. And, it can be the beginning of a lifelong relationship and kinship with that particular goddess. So, yeah, stories can open all sorts of magical doors.
Thank you so much for opening these little doors for us in this conversation into your practice and your way of thinking and your life. Opening a little bit of the night house. I really invite anybody listening to this to get your hands on this beautiful book and spend time doing this magic, decades of life lived in magic that are woven and centuries that are woven through this beautiful book. Do you want to tell folks where they should go to find you, the most exciting ways to get involved in your work these days?
Well, I have 2 websites. Actually, I have 3 websites, but you can just go to danielledulsky.com. That's the main one. And then that will open these other doors to these other websites if you feel called to go that direction. I teach writing a lot. I teach, traditional book proposal writing and how to script that. And so I have a program that's open for registration right now. And then I also have virtual covens and longer year-long witchcraft apprenticeships. So yeah, I do a lot.
She does it all, folks. Join the Hag School if you're up for it. All right. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Danielle.
All blessings be. Thank you. Thank you.
You too. We say, blessed fucking be.
Blessed fucking be.
You must be a witch.